Right. Good evening, everyone. So, this is an impromptu recording that Jack Murphy, when he had been on his rowing machine, said. 50 minutes of steady state while listening to Millerman explain Strauss, and the return to the ancients go slow to go fast. Okay. I have no idea who Millerman is. R. Strauss, J. Strauss, How Strauss. So, not sure what he meant, but return to the ancients. That sparked something in my mind. I sent this, hopefully not annoying him, series of replies. So, I will start with this. I'll presume to think I know what you mean by return to the ancients. This tends to happen at times when there's times of revelation and cycles clicking over. The thing to me lately is why some ancients are returning more saliently than others, that is, at certain times in history, what people focus on. The return to the ancients, by the way, I'm interpreting that to be that at a certain time of turbulence, people look to certain bits in the past for structure, for guidance, for some type of analogy, some type of compass. You see, the Renaissance was a maturing assertion of a return to Apollonian ancients that had started to revive around the year 1000 with the rise of humanism. Before that was barbarian kings and Byzantines, and I was realizing that these barbarian kings and Byzantines often analogized themselves to Old Testament situations, the Byzantines specifically. And let's see, further. The ancients that classical Islam returned to, round about 900 to 1200, were Greek and also Egyptian, but very late Hellenistic, Gnostic Egyptian, so still Apollonian. Each essence seeks the opposite to know itself. This is your basic yin-yang Taoist framework there. I believe that. I think it's true. So the Faustian West, that's our current frame set, our current civilization, which is dealing with space. We think of things as empty space quite a lot. X, Y, Z axis, the cathedral, infinity. We call the design of architecture spaces. It's a theater space. This would have been anathema to an ancient Greek. So our culture that we're familiar with has sought to know itself in the Greeks and Romans and the Apollonians, who understood things as solid body and form. And so in looking at the opposite, we understand ourselves better. We analogize ourselves to Rome for many reasons, but it helps make them like, why not analogize ourselves to China or to ancient Mexico? Well, first of all, we know we happen, because of the way that history has come to us and culturally connected, we know more about those things, but also we're attracted to know more about it because it is a natural opposite to our own ways of understanding. Our Faustian West sought to understand things through the Apollonian Greco-Roman space to body. So I'm thinking, how do we take this further? The Magian world system, which is connects both the Byzantines and the Islamic civilization, and the older Middle Eastern civilizations that continued through there in Syria and the Levant. So the domed cavern of this is Spengler stuff, by the way, and I'm pulling this from Spengler and Decline of the West, the world systems and the prime symbol. So the domed cavern idea that governed the thinking of the Islam and the Byzantine Orthodoxy sought Gnostic and Neoplatonic transcendence. So they saw their own world as this kind of this ordered divine dome that God sets up the universe. There's outside the universe with the heavens. There's inside the universe with us. The crystal spheres of the Ptolemaic world system. And so there's the actualized world, and then the opposite is the transcendent world, the world beyond. So they were interested in Gnosticism and kind of Platonic, the star-based stuff, the idea of going out, going beyond. That was foreign to them. That was opposite to them and helped them understand themselves. Now us, we're at the terminal special end phase of the Faustian. Ooh, this is not a TV safe jacket. Ooh. Okay. Anyways, so New Age sentiment and alternative archaeologists seek the old kingdom of Egypt and even the faintest shreds of Atlantis. It's all flood, all waveform thinking about cycle and reciprocity. And even Jack, in his exercise, is rowing for his exercise. So that's a fun coincidence with water. What does all this tell us about the naturally emergent spiritual and intellectual sensibility of emergent order within our transitional liminality? So then I say this will become a video tonight. I've been procrastinating about Rumble. This will be both YouTube and Rumble. We'll see. So I've often thought about this, and please tell me below in the comments how far was 6 minutes. You can stop listening now if you want. That's the summary. So this is also something that was brought to my mind in Kandinsky, in Vasily Kandinsky, when he wrote about On the Spiritual in Art. He seemed to feel that there were different periods of the world where the art history that they focused on spoke to them in a certain way. And I don't know if he got into the meaning of this, but it seemed, I don't think he dwelled on it, because he was more interested in how art expressed itself and how inspiration happened. It's a beautiful essay, and it was really an essay about how inspiration happens. And our kind of creative mindset, our inspirations, our understandings, our science, and our philosophy, for whatever reason, there seems to be a trend. Of course, one person can be inspired by one thing, and another person can be inspired by another thing, but when things mush together, there tends to be trends and directions. There has been a trend towards the Egyptian. There's kind of an Egyptian Renaissance feeling in what people have been doing and working with. Not in the kind of cheap way of, although it is interesting that this came out in the 1920s with Art Deco, which was called a highly modern style, and it went back to Babylonian, but also very Egyptian stylistic sources and reinterpreting them in a modern way. But for example, I always forget if it was 1908 or 1911, the Werkbund, the Deutsche Werkbund Congress, where it was a bunch of industrialists, a precursor to the Bauhaus, a bunch of industrialists and architects and designers, and graphic designers too, across the German-speaking world, came together in this really effective thing, which a lot of famous people participated in, and Walter Motesius wrote that the industrial building in the United States, which they admired at the time, the very large-scale stuff like grain silos and things, that they thought that this was the grandness of building that humanity had not seen since the Egyptians. They didn't say since the Romans, because, you know, that kind of classical, the neoclassical stuff, they felt was played out. They didn't want to do that anymore, and it was played out. It was kind of exhausted as a means of exploring. They themselves said from Schinkel onwards, Schinkel, the 19th century architect, had been not very interesting. Frank Lloyd Wright had said that this was terrible. He talked about the death of the cornice, that on skyscrapers, these classical tops, the cornice is the top of the building that kind of projects outward, has the dentailing on it or details. And he was saying for skyscrapers, these things make no sense. Honestly, on some skyscrapers, I think they do. sometimes. But Frank didn't want to be limited by this imitation of the past. Frank Lloyd Wright hated Renaissance architecture too. He called it an imitation of an imitation of an imitation of an imitation. Those domes he called the Pantheon on top of the Parthenon, the U.S. Capitol, right? And the U.S. Capitol was imitating stuff that, say, Palladio had done, or some of the other Italian architects, which itself was imitating the Romans, which itself was imitating the Greeks, and he wanted to get something more vital and direct. But he didn't want to imitate anybody. And he didn't. He didn't really. He was very successful at being original. It's not easy. The Germans, on the other hand, were looking for a way to be extremely practical and to say, well, they're being very Hegelian. They're saying, what is the spirit which is upwelling from the society and then coming down out of the absolute across the negative into the concrete? You know, what is this grand trend of the world which we can learn from and then harmonize with and then elevate our own inspirations in order to do something that really just resonates with the way the world is. They were interested in trying to get that right. It's a good thing you can do if you can do it right. And they thought that this was an Egyptian direction, interestingly enough. I think they were onto something. Not that we should all go around building pyramids. That would be rather ridiculous. Andy Warhol made fun of that a little bit in his book on philosophy, thinking that someone should live inside a pyramid. But that dumb but fun book that he wrote, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol. But those three images, by the way, from the thumbnail, there's no real meaning to that. I just was thinking about people from three different eras who looked back. Erasmus of Rotterdam was famous for saying ad fontes, that you should go back to the sources, not the scholastics who interpreted the ancient sources. Go back to the ancient sources themselves. We were done with interpretations of interpretation. So he was going back to, he was a humanist in late Renaissance, early Reformation, who thought you should go back to the classical things, right? We talked about this before. Maimonides, he was a scholar in, I believe, in Andalusia, Spain, and he was a Jewish scholar who was going back to, this was part of the going back to the Neoplatonic stuff. He was an actual person who was doing that as the classical Islam was doing its thing, Magian, right? And so it's not just classical Islam. Obviously, he was in Spain, and and then I was trying to find something that worked both visually and talked about where we were, and everyone knows that Liz Taylor is how every 20th century person thinks about Cleopatra. So that was that was my thing there. It's trying to make it work both visually and thematically. Looking back, our current, something to indicate our current stuff, looking back to Egyptian things. I suppose I could have put a picture of Graham Hancock up there, but too late. So what does it really mean? This essence. How far am I in with my rambling? 13 minutes. Okay, maybe I'll stop at 20. This is what happens when I'm unscripted. Hopefully you like it. Let me know. So the qualities is really the important thing. So what is the essence of the time that's trying to look for an opposite essence of sorts in order to understand itself? The one that I am most familiar with, and I think that most of you watching would be most familiar with, would be the sense of the West, the sense of the space, articulated by Descartes and also, Brudelleschi, with vanishing points and all of this. That this is the Western sense of space that we're all very familiar with. Philosophically, mathematically, it governs lots of the ways of the way we think, so much so that we're not always conscious of it until we realize that, the Egyptians thought of things as paths, right? And that the Chinese and Japanese thought of things as the meandering way of nature, and that the the Greco-Romans understood things as a solid body, the way they did. And you can look at the transformation of the Pythagorean, what we call the Pythagorean Theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The Egyptians in the Rhind papyrus didn't understand it as an algebraic equation like we would. That's this kind of spatial linear dynamic that you're calculating coordinates. The Greeks didn't do that. The Arabs, through the Indians, are the ones who gave us the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. They gave us that. Both the Indians and the Arabs gave that to the West, and that's how we say it now, even though we think of it a bit differently. Arab and Indian math was all about, it was the cavern, it was the balancing. What is inside the dome, what is outside the dome? Look as above, so below. That was the birth of algebra, balancing around the equal point to the zero and x and the unknown. They didn't have the coordinate system. It was Descartes and in the West that added the coordinates to that. And then the Greeks, it was all, if you read the original Euclid, and if you read the way that Plato writes about Socrates teaching the slave boy Pythagoras, it's done it's physicalized. They did their math in sand with lines. It was about seeing how you calculated the hypotenuse by literally drawing squares. You would draw squares from the legs and divide those up and count them up and add them up, and then realize that you could make it into the area of the one along the hypotenuse, and you would demonstrate it that way. It was highly physicalized. And so what we think of as the same thing, the Pythagorean Theorem, yes, it gets you the same answers, it gets you the same results, but the theorem isn't the same thing in these very different periods of history. The theorem is understood in a different way. And what's changing? I made a mathematician very angry with me once. He was really frustrated because he really had what seems to me like a religious belief. His religious belief was that mathematics are eternal and that it's always the same. So, and mathematics might be eternal. I wouldn't argue with that, but I would say that the human understanding of it does adapt and change, and that's useful, and it's interesting, and it's important to notice. So, where are we now? This is the thing. I don't think we're particularly getting any help from how we handle Pythagoras. Maybe we do. Well, actually, we do. No, we do, because what are we talking about now with Pythagoras? What would interest most people is Pythagorean tuning. There's an argument. I don't want to make booms in the microphone with my elbow, sorry. The whole idea of Pythagorean tuning, the 432 hertz versus A440. Do you go by the tempering by the even halving of the strings and all the way up the octaves for something that's really consonant? So it becomes about wave form. It's no longer about the space of the line, which it had been for the West. It's no longer about the body of the string, as it was for the Greeks. For us, it's something about the behavior of the waves. And how this relates to us triggering ideas of Egyptian things, I don't know. But again, what's happening is that there's an interest in this flood myth of Atlantis, of the flood myth coming out of Egypt, people really straining really hard to find a flood myth in Egypt. I think there is one. It's not easy to find. It's about the Edfu texts, the temple at Edfu, temple to Horus and Hathor. But it's you really have to look to find it. And there's lots of things that you can find in Egypt. Egypt's literature is amazing. It's huge. Why are we focusing on this water myth? Not just the regular annual flood stuff, but a big water myth. It was a really huge flood and about this whole fiery thing coming out of the sky, and then the land of trampling, and then a sea of reeds that grew up out of it. And it's like, okay, that's what we're focused on. Why? I'm not quite sure, except that some people would like to prove that the Atlantis myth has broader roots than we expected. But why are we drawn towards that? This idea of a country that was made up of concentric circles, of alternation of land and water. Again, the principle of alternation is the principle of waveforms. Positive and negative, binary. Leibniz was an utter genius. Gottfried Leibniz, in many ways. I was speaking with a friend of mine about this earlier tonight, is that he invented binary. We wouldn't have computers that behave the way today. You wouldn't be seeing me and hearing me like you are now without the invention of binary, which Leibniz figured out because Jesuits were able to send him the I Ching that they picked up in China, and he looked at that old Chinese wisdom and says, wow, this is kind of layered over with all kinds of superstition here, just like the Bible has been layered over with superstition. But if we're trying to do things like find out what Jesus originally said, I can look at this Chinese stuff and think about, what did the original Chinese scholars think about before there was, all this kind of chance and luck type stuff layered on top of it. That's what he thought. Regardless if that's what the I Ching was or is, I'm not an expert, but he thought it might be that, and he was inspired, and he looked at the I Ching and realized that you can use it as like a way of calculating number. And from that, he was inspired to realize that you can create any system of numbers. You can create images on a screen. You can create any kind of representation, any kind of communication that you want by breaking everything down to abstracted layers of code of ones and zeros. That was really brilliant. Leibniz, I think, is a grand figure, just as he wasn't Egyptian, just as Plato was to the Magian era. Perhaps Leibniz is to us, someone a few hundred years earlier, who is somehow ahead of the curve or not really in sync with his own time, but speaks in a way that people at his own time thought, what is this junk? But then later on, we realize, oh wow, our frame of mind is really in tune with this person. And they were kind of correct in both times, but you get more attention when the rest of the people have something that's like it was. If that's making any sense. I think it does. But the binary was very important, and so it's the 1 and the 0 is an oscillation. And here's the connection between analog and digital. Analog is a waveform. You can think of the one note is a frequency, and the frequency is a sine wave oscillation vibrating along that note of that resonance. You think of waves in water like that. If you ever have a long hose in the yard and you shake it like that, you can see the waves move through it. And it's similar, analogous for the sound that we hear, for the vibrations that we feel, and even scientists say down to the atoms. Make the fingers, this table, the computer screen, everything. It can be understood in terms of vibration. And this was the big switch that happened in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics went away from the old Newtonian spatial dynamics into these dynamics of vibration. And so then the 1 and the 0, the binary, are the poles, are the opposites, the digital opposites of which, the framework by which you can describe the actual beautiful analog phenomenon of the oscillation of the waveform. And in a sense, you can look at that from our mindset. This might not at all be what Plato was thinking about, probably, but the concentric circles of land and water, if you're traveling across it, if you're looking at it, that's going to create an oscillation of a frequency. Water, land, water, land, water, land. And Atlantis was disrupted by a great cataclysm, by a great dissonance, by a great shaking, a bad vibration. Brian Wilson talking about good vibrations. We have, so we're looking at, also people looking at what the Egyptians were doing. There's all these speculations now that maybe the Egyptians used sonic agitation. Sonic levitation isn't science fiction, it exists. I think there's acoustic levitation of frogs. That might not have been acoustic levitation, that might have been something else, but it was hilarious. You see this frog in a lab, and he's spinning around, and like they started floating like little pea-sized things, but then eventually they got the levitation to spin. The poor frog must have gotten frog motion sick, but it looks hilarious with the frog spinning around. So acoustic levitation, or other means of levitation, exist. The idea that you could get something to vibrate. If you get it to vibrate at a proper frequency, you can reduce the friction and move it more easily. And so there's all kinds of interesting speculation, not really based on much evidence, but it's interesting that you could get, if you had like these trumpet devices, you could get a stone, a heavy Egyptian stone, to slide more smoothly. There are old that thing could run more smoothly. So yes, all right. So yeah, it's 11:32. They're really doing that. So you get the okay. So you get the acoustic agitation to either do things where you're reducing friction is one thing that it'll do. And again, we don't know if they did this. There's acoustic agitation for drill cores, which I've seen good video of demonstration of, is that you can use sonic agitation to accelerate stone cutting, and it really works amazingly well. It's a beautiful way of doing something. You send a tone of the right frequency to do it, and you're agitating the abrasive in a slurry, the same type of stuff that happens when you use a diamond saw, but the slurry is doing the real abrasive stuff, and it's the sound vibration that's making all the particles move and agitate and do the cutting. The Egyptians might have used this, but I think what's even more interesting is the fact that we think they did. Not all of us, but this is something that wasn't really coming up as an idea before. And then there are things like theremins, this thing that you play an instrument that you don't touch. I don't know if that would have occurred to any other. Radio is another thing. Tesla and Tesla's brilliance in Marconi's marketing, about the idea that you can use vibrations to send something across a distance. Electromagnetic vibrations, and pick it up, a broadcast antenna, receiving antenna. That's not really something that the Western mind as such would have been thinking of. The whole idea of a spatial situation. Not really. It's spatial and this other waveform agitation thing with resonance. The field of cymatics is also very interesting. The ideas of the patterns. Cymatics is essentially the study of the patterns that come up in resonance. And serious scientists tend to make fun of it because they consider it to be a toy. Well, most new science starts out this way. Michael Faraday himself, he was supposedly demonstrating to Queen Victoria, and was actually being a bit rude when she asked him, "Well, what is this for?" And he didn't call her, and he called her Madam. He called the Queen Madam, and he said, "Madam, what use is a baby?" He didn't think that there should be when something is so new like that, like electromagnetism was in Faraday's experiments. You're not going to understand enough about it to try to find the practical thing. You got to understand first. And so with whatever this is, whatever this essence is, I think we can understand it better by trying to understand what was the Egyptian mental essence. Spengler thought the Egyptian mental essence was one of path. Okay, so the idea of vibration along path. It's an audio tape. It's the groove in a record. Vibration along path. Yeah, that does help clarify it. So there's probably more there. This is a start. I think I've gotten somewhere interesting with this, and thank you to Jack Murphy for talking about his workout. I still don't know what he was listening to. He didn't provide a link. But, alright, it's been 30 minutes. Thank you for listening.